There we go. Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for being able to come and join us today. Excited to be able to welcome Robbie Young, CEO of Animoca Brands, to be able to share some really cool insights with you guys about where we're currently seeing the space, what's getting funding, what trends are coming forward, and a really good opportunity for you guys to ask your questions. So as we're having an initial conversation, I highly recommend you guys be thinking about what are the key questions that you have, and this is your chance now to be able to get a really cool answer out of Robbie and to be able to go forward from there. Sound all good?
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, just for anyone in the room who isn't aware of you, Robbie, I'm sure they are, but why don't you just give like a brief overview of yourself and a bit about your history that's led to you now being Animoca.
Okay, so hi, my name's Robbie, for those of you who don't know me. I've been with Animoca Brands now for 13 years, which gives you a little bit of hint of how long we've been around. I started actually, I've been in tech for 30 years, in everything from telecoms originally through to Web 1 in the early days in the 90s, back to traditional media for a decade in the early 2000s. And then I joined Animoca Brands after I sold my last business. And when I joined Animoca, we were a Web 2, free-to-play mobile game studio. And this, for us, so kind of the journey to blockchain was really as a result of having been in the games business and the games business slowing down, right? There was a huge growth in mobile from 2009 when we started through to 2015, 2014. It started to, you could see it was not 30%, 50% a year anymore industry-wide. It was starting to mature. And so we began looking for areas of growth. That's when we discovered blockchain. So 2017, we started working with a team on a hackathon project, and they had just written the ERC 721 standard and created the NFT, and that team went on to become Dapper Labs, and the game we worked on with them was called CryptoKitties, and so that was kind of our entree to blockchain.
Yeah, and I think that's a really cool thing for everyone to be able to see as well. Robbie has a really good rich history and vision from where it's begin and where it's kind of started going. And in your kind of mind there, with that very deep, being there almost at a very beginning, what's your kind of interest and curiosity taking to it at the moment for where you can start to see the space moving towards I think it's very exciting, even convergence technologies that we're seeing over this next decade. Where's your curiosity taking you?
So I think we came at it from a slightly different lens. A lot of people who were really early in crypto came, because of the Bitcoin white paper and this idea of it as a reaction to the financial crisis of '08. And, how are we going to create self-sovereign money and not have, these central points of failure when the world financial system can just, ruin everybody's home mortgages and everything as a result of, a small few bankers making mistakes or risky decisions. And I think we approached it differently because, as I said, our path came from content. So we discovered blockchain to be interesting not because of fungible tokens, but because of non-fungible tokens, actually. Because from our perspective, it was a completely logical extension of what we did in free-to-play games. The idea in free-to-play games is you buy virtual currency and you spend it to buy virtual stuff. And we're like, well, if you tokenize that, that's logical, right? You just give true digital ownership of your stuff to people who are playing games. Now, obviously, we've been through some cycles, and gaming with Web3 Rails is going through a bit of a hard patch right now, let's just say. Shout out to all the game developers. But I do think that one thing, and I was thinking about this earlier about what to talk about today, is that I think that what I'm seeing today is a result of a lot of definitely we're seeing maturity in parts of the space, right?
Yep.
I seem to remember doing talks like this with you when Solana was a scrappy upstart as opposed to the man. And I think that we're at a point now where the industry has matured. We've got traction, we have a seat at the table, let's just say, and we have to think back to what are the principles for which we all got into this industry to begin with, and are we actually pushing our products in directions that adhere to what that vision was originally, or have we lost our way a little bit? And so I think I'd pose that question to people.
Yeah, and I think it's very important to be thinking about now. You're seeing a lot more institutions get involved, whether they be financial institutions, asset managers, or the big corporates, whether that's be like Google or Stripe or like these big companies. And you're seeing a lot of them sell up, think from the perspective of I need to create my own chain. And I need to kind of privatize it and own the whole vertical stack. But to your point of, is that true to the initial ethos and the values of which the industry began? Like back in 2008, where initially it was like, oh, we don't want to be held to then those central parties. There's an opportunity to decentralize that and give power across to everybody across the world. And now we, as an industry, it's our role, the builders, to be able to show to them that there are better pathways. And you can be able to utilize and build upon a better version than just doing it all yourself. And you can use public blockchains, you can build on top of these ecosystems and leverage the new things that previously you couldn't do. And there's a lot of new perks that become available when you start thinking in this way and building from that kind of front.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, like, over the summer, we announced a partnership between us and the Provenance blockchain, which is a blockchain that just focuses specifically on RWAs. And the initial project is something that I think kind of highlights this dichotomy, which is we are tokenizing digital native assets from the portfolio of Figure, for those of you who are familiar with Figure, which is now a public company in the US. And Figure has done something amazing. Figure has tokenized $15 billion worth of home equity loans. They're already tokenized. It's the biggest RWA portfolio in existence by a long shot. And as somebody who builds in the Web3 space, that's really cool. There's $15 billion of home equity loans that have been tokenized. Why aren't we talking about it more? And the reason that most people don't know about it is because actually there are only 10 token holders of the $15 billion, right? It's BlackRock, it's JP Morgan, it's Goldman Sachs, et cetera, and those tokens just sit there, right? Like gold in Fort Knox, kind of. And so they're not reaping the benefits of tokenization. They've tokenized it for the purpose of tokenizing it, which is great, but the tokens aren't fulfilling their potential. So what we did with this venture is we're taking those tokens, putting them in vaults, and issuing tokens against them, right? Yep. And that way, the tokens that will be on Provenance can be used in DeFi and have access to 24/7 liquidity and access to retail and small institutions and hedge funds, et cetera, and give them a life. Because what we want to do is we want to take that incredible home equity loan portfolio, which gives 9% stable yield per year, but actually give everybody access to it, because that's the fundamental mission of why we got into the space. It's supposed to be democratizing access to stuff.
And when you talk about this Provenance program that's being able to utilize this, are you also seeing a trend of, because I think I'm seeing a lot of it as well from our side, of more institutional players wanting to play with institutional DeFi? We did Institutional Builder Night a couple of weeks ago, and you had Camino there, Solstice there, and they're talking about like the potentials of what you can now do with institutional DeFi, and then how that opens up more opportunities for everyone else to be able to jump in and get involved into it. Is that a trend that you've noticed a lot happening this year? Has there been any kind of sparks that you think have like instigated this a little bit more, that it started to really start kicking forward? Or is there anything you see coming that is really going to elevate it further?
So I think the sparks or the catalyst for this has actually been the so-called stablecoin summer. Is that what we're calling it officially now, I think?
There's always some sort of summer.
Exactly. So the stablecoin summer, because I think that the fact that stablecoins are now a relatively mainstream proposition where I think financial institutions, regulators, governments, nobody kind of thinks that stablecoins are risky and a bad idea. They're just like, how are we going to do this? Because everybody needs tokenized money, and it's not a really difficult ask to say this is a product that's useful, right? So the natural question is, first, as somebody smarter than me from finance explained to me, the first thing you need to do in this whole process of revamping the financial system is figuring out how you tokenize money, because you need it for settlement for everything else, because you can't create another product until you have money to start, right? So kind of the first principle is you need to have tokenized money and stablecoins to start before we can build this new, brave new world of online finance, of on-chain finance. And then the second part is the natural extension to that becomes payment and settlement. So those are the areas where I think we've seen the most traction over the last year or so and these are from projects and people who have been building for a long time in the space, but really starting to see traction in terms of getting licensed or getting traditional banks or financial institutions on board to offer solutions for things like payment and settlement, because those are the core building blocks before you get to the more exotic DeFi and things like that.
And when we talk about some of those like payments, stable coins, before the exotic DeFi stuff, do you think that there's space for smaller time founders to be able to jump into it? Like early stage, pre-seed, seed team, to be able to be closing these big institutional clients, to be jumping into it? Or do you think it's going to be the already established companies kind of taping that, and then there's other opportunities for the early stage founders to jump onto?
I think there's absolutely opportunities for early stage founders. I think what happens in finance is like other industries, there's innovation and then there's regulatory capture, and you need to be able to navigate both. What typically happens is the big entrenched players will be very, very slow to innovate. And frankly, this is true in the games industry as well, ironically. So I think there's a lot of room for founders to create amazing tools and amazing businesses that will become part of this financial ecosystem, because the big players are not going to innovate because they already have a big oligopoly, right? They've got a good business. They don't want to put it at risk by being, too innovative, because at the end of the day, they're afraid of eating their core business. That's a very, very hard thing for a big company to do. And you only typically see that where there's a founder who owns a big percentage of the business still and makes that decision of their own accord and says, well, F that, I'm going to go and, eat my core business and keep innovating. But that's quite unusual. Once it's natural once you get big to get risk averse.
And you start slowing down, and then that's the entrepreneur's speed that they get to take advantage of.
Totally. And I think you can see examples of that because if you think about, all of the finance apps and banking apps like that everybody uses in the room, I'm sure we can do like informal polls, and lots of you will use Revolut and Monzo and all kinds of neobanking tools, which essentially were not launched out of traditional banking services. And if you're using traditional banking apps, you can see the fingerprints of all those neobanking apps and UI UXs and stuff there, because they were forced to innovate to keep up with the neobanks.
And it's a really good parallel to what you can do now, because it sets like a really nice vision there as well of there's real space to be able to break into it. And as an investor, when you're looking at these early stage teams, how are you distinguishing between the ones that could go ahead and do that, could build like a next Revolut, or could maybe just reach a shadow of that? How are you understanding, and what are the key characteristics, the key process you go through for understanding whether, this is actually one we see potential in, and so much potential, we're ready to like back it and see them all the way there?
So I think it's hard to say at the early stages with teams, but usually at a certain point, they kind of filter out between teams that you feel like will absolutely go the distance and be able to carve out a new category or a new space for themselves, and teams who are just really good at a specific thing, and that they're going to become that department at Goldman Sachs. And it's about building it for M&A, because ultimately the big innovative, the big entrenched players are just going to enter the space through M&A because they can afford to, and they'll wait until the market shakes out, pick when there's two winners, they'll be like, okay, I'll take one, and JP Morgan takes one, and that's essentially what happens. And if you look, again, to make the parallel to the games industry, same thing. I mean, EA hasn't done an innovative thing in decades, but they've bought every innovator along the way.
And when you're looking at that, that's a really good distinction between ones that should be building to own a category and build a new category within that, and then ones who should be building to be the very best at a domain, such that someone wants to acquire them in order to be able to come into it. Where do you see the difference of like at what point should a founder know which path it's going down? Is it like from the very beginning, they should be building with one set in mind? Is it something that, well, you just need to first get out that initial, like proving that there's market traction for it, proving there's demand, making sure you got the right team of founders around you, just the very early stage things before you then even start going into that? Or is there like a methodology that you think about between actually this is designed for either one pathway?
I think building a business like that is very much like building a successful product. It often requires a multi-pronged approach that's much more nuanced than you would think originally, because a lot of people go into it thinking, if I build the best product, then this will become the most popular product and the highest revenue product, et cetera, because it's the best and everybody will know, right? But it's a little bit like, making the world's greatest video game and putting it on the App Store, and then nobody finds it because there's no marketing and it just sits there, right? And I think building a business is exactly the same way. At a certain point, you have to ask yourself, okay, so maybe I have the best product in the category, but do I have all of the right regulatory conditions to allow me to do everything I want with my product, or to help keep out my competitors because I'm the first one who got licensed in this jurisdiction with this, addressable market that's really great for my product? Do I have the right financial backing and partners? Because actually, I have a great product, but I'm going to need $300 million if I'm going to go any further in this category, because look at who I'm competing with. Because actually, if I'm making a financial services product and the banks decide to wake up, they have limitless checks they can write to just crush me. So am I prepared for that? And so I think a lot of it is about what I would loosely call resourcing: human resources, capital resources, market regulatory resources, as well as the product. And you have to get all of those things working in the same direction.
And I think that's really important for the founders to be able to be picturing and understanding how is your product coming together, how are you playing in the regulatory environment, what capital are you bringing on to be able to help support you. And before we go into a couple of key questions from everyone else, when you are then, like, if we double down on the, like, bringing on the investment point of view and build, essentially establishing your cap table and understanding what investors to work with, different type of question. How much would you value IRL, like investment? So like being able to like sit down with your investor, speak with them face to face, have those regular check-ins in person, versus being able to raise capital globally. So for like UK founders here, raising capital in Asia versus America versus here in the UK, how do you evaluate when you're building out that cap table, how you should split it?
So I think obviously, first choice is you get lots of in-person time from people if you could, right? That's the dream. But I think to be realistic, time is more important than in-person or online. It's being able to, because that's the most valuable asset, is to be able to have the time of people whose opinions you value and who can be helpful. Now, not all investors are helpful, right? Sometimes investors just try to micromanage your business and don't know, anything about what you're doing, and that can be a burden. So you have to judge for yourself. But often, especially if you're a younger founder, I think it is really essential. I was thinking about this. I was at a conference on Friday, and I had a couple of meetings with founders there, and I'm always amazed how many conversations I have with founders who I meet for the first time who actually just need mentoring. Because when I started my first business when I was about 28, and that was considered young at the time. And these days, I meet people who are still in school, obviously, founding companies. And I think if I have one regret in my career is that I never worked for a big company, because before that I worked for a small, medium-sized company, a few hundred people. But I never worked in a big corporate place where I had a clear mentor and I had, I had all that structure. So, and I feel like it took many years for me in my own businesses and relationships and stuff to learn those skills that maybe if I'd been in a very structured environment, which is why people often appreciate on resumes that, you worked for such and such brand name place, because as boring as it may have been to spend 5 years at PwC, you learned certain skills there, right? And then that's a helpful foundation. So I think definitely something to think about is that relationship with your investors. The other thing I would think about is don't worry about valuation. Everybody always gets stressed out about valuation, and I think it's the last thing that matters, to be honest. If you have people who want to give you money and give you their time, just take it. That's my personal view, because they don't always want to give you their money and time, so when they do, take it. And also, try to bring as many people as possible on that journey with you. It is a management process, and that's something that if you start a business, you have to realize that you're going to have to spend a significant amount of your time managing those relationships with your shareholders and investors. They're not just going to write you a check and then be there on demand. They're also going to be demanding, and their happiness with the journey and how much they are giving of themselves also depends on how you manage them, right? If you give them good regular updates and are transparent and stuff, they will engage with you more, because guess what? You're a good founder, and you're, going to be a star in their portfolio, and they'll introduce you to their friends. And, because again, especially if you're younger, relationships are everything, and it takes time to build those. And if you have more senior investors, they can help with that.
And I think a big thread that you talked about there was those relationships, either that relationship with your mentor or the relationship with your investor. And from your experience of building these relationships with these founders, are there anything that you've noticed that I love that? They gave me they either was really consistent in their monthly update that they did, or they did a Loom video in their update and that was a lot easier for me to consume, or different types of, they caught me at the conference because they knew I was going to be there. Have there been any notices where you've been actually that founder did a really good job at making sure to nurture that relationship and give me all the information I need and make sure my team and everyone else around us were fully up to date and understood what was happening so that we could be able to give our best support back to them?
I don't think there's a perfect recipe, because it is about interpersonal relationships. So you have to kind of judge, and get to know the people that you're working with. I think a lot of people who, in the job of traditional venture, most of your job is meeting founders and weeding through plans and pitch decks and things like that all the time. And so there is an endless onslaught of them. If you just, put VC in your profile on LinkedIn, that's 10 emails a day, every day of the week, 365 days a year, And so I think that how you can convey those updates and that information to them, but be respectful of their time, I think will really help, because if you can be flexible, you'll tend to get more time from them. And I think because what you need ultimately is for them to want to make more time for you also in their busy schedules, and to make you a founder that's interesting for them. So you have to kind of tread on that fine line between being a little bit too much and overbearing and too attentive, right, sycophantic, and being very open and transparent and stuff with them.
Yeah. Oh, that's very cool. And yeah, that's the real interpersonal relationship, and being able to manage that. It's something that's a nice way to think about it. It's almost like a goal for yourself of how much time do they want to give me, and how have I been able to position myself as someone interesting enough that they want to be able to have that time with me.
Yeah, and you'll have to figure out, it's like anybody else that you interact with. Everybody has their preferred communication method, Some people may prefer that you go and take them out for coffee once a week or once a month, and others may prefer that you just have, a WhatsApp group and ping them at any hour of the day with questions. So it's up to you to kind of suss the people out.
Awesome. Oh, very cool. Well, I think this will be a good chance now to open up to the floor. So who would like to take the first question? Adam put his hand up first.
Hi there, my name is Arda, and I will be asking about the settlements, payment sort of questions. Right now, companies in European Union and UK, they need to be strictly following the regulatory side, whereas the companies that are based in Seychelles, BVIs and stuff, they have a quicker response to the actions for any sort of steps that they want to take. I have a company that is settled in Czech Republic, whereas I'm switching to MICA right now. But the stuff that they're asking from me and then for the compliance side, it's a huge burden for us.
Yep.
Do you think that it's better to build a fintech companies in BVI stuff, or European Unions and UK side would give credibility, so we should stick in that side with the jurisdictions?
Sure. I think it all depends on how you plan to interact with your addressable market, where you think you're going to find that audience, and also what the regulatory requirements are for you to interact with that audience. So, for example, the online gambling industry, to my knowledge, is pretty much all in Gibraltar because the regulatory environment there is conducive to running an online casino. And it allows for them to reach through their online channels to the EU and other markets, right? And so I guess the question is whether that works in your case, in which case you can balance the amount of compliance. The other thing is there must be a reason that there is so much compliance, and does not having yourself located within a kind of a MiCA jurisdiction prevent you from offering the full suite of services that you would like to offer to people in those jurisdictions. If it's only part of a global plan, then maybe it's less important and you can consider some type of an offshore destination, but ultimately, it's going to be for your council to advise you on that.
Understood. Thank you. Maybe the second direct question would be that, do you think it's worth to do it in the UK or EU, or it's better to be flexible when you are doing a startup?
Some of that depends on your investor base and whether they're also domestic in the UK and EU and thinking about those markets because they want you to pursue them because those are markets they understand. But I think ultimately it's where you think you're going to find your customers. And you have to align it to that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
My question is kind of about the meta. How important would you say being aligned with the current meta is? So before we had this whole like pump.fun thing and every founder in the world was trying to build a pump.fun copy. Now we've got everyone trying to build a hyperliquid copy and doing anything with AI and treasury and stable coins and stuff. How important do you think that is to be aligned with the meta, or do you think the market's changing and that's not as important?
You're trying to see if I want to invest in your pump.fun for perps? Okay. So that's a difficult question because honestly, it depends on runway, in my opinion, because I think you have to be keenly attuned to the meta if you need to make money in the short term, because that's where the money is. So you need to follow the money. I think the thing about the meta is that it also informs where the direction of the industry is headed, and also gives you an idea, like particularly for the vast majority of Web3, which tends to be around where liquidity exists, then the meta does speak to where liquidity exists. And also if there is going to be a trend. So for example, if the trend of perps over spot, at least for the retail consumers, continues, then that's a whole new way of thinking about how you build liquidity on chains for DeFi and other things. And so we have to start thinking about that. Or is that a temporary bubble because actually it's ridiculously risky because these are all derivative instruments and everybody will wake up 6 months from now and be like, oh my God, what were we thinking? Because these are, CDOs on steroid on chain or something like that. I don't know, right? So I think you've always got to be paying attention to the meta, because one of the big challenges of this space is it's a little bit like being in AI as well. Because things evolve so quickly, you need to be very agile, because if you make yourself a 2-year plan, like where you end up if you just go heads down and build for 2 years may not be where anybody is anymore. And so, you have no choice but to pay attention to the meta.
What do you think should be a healthy ratio between B2B and B2C investment or products in the blockchain world? Because at the moment, for example, we talk a lot about financial products, which are mainly B2B, and or for retail consumer base that is mainly interested in making money, generating wealth.
Yeah.
Where do you see the service layer in that? Because otherwise we will always be dependent on what we call institutions, but like the banks and so on, because they have the real customers that use a bank not just to make money, but just because they need a safe place to hold their money, or because I want to access music, videos, art, things like this. What do you think is the healthy ratio to start owning the real consumer base?
So I don't know that there's a right answer to that question, because it kind of depends for individual founders on where your product fits in the food chain. And most people make a decision that, I'm about consumer products or I'm about institution. And the difference between that is usually down to what you know. Meaning, if you come from TradFi and you bring an existing set of relationships, I worked at Goldman on the prop desk, and I know all the hedge funds in town. So that's an asset, because then you can make a product that caters to the fact that you can introduce all those hedge funds as part of your initial sales cycle. Whereas if, like us, we came from video games. So when we thought about financial services products, when we built our first things for DeFi and stuff, we're all about consumers because we understand consumers. And that's kind of what we understand as a company. So I think that part is really important, because ultimately we're going to have all these products. And I think that the cool thing about Web3 generally is that actually as varied as all of these products are, the one thing they all have in common is tokenization, and that actually the fact of tokenization is building interoperability for all the products. And the cool superpower of Web3 is the fact that, I could take that $15 billion of home equity loans and actually put it in your hands as an individual consumer and make that link, ultimately, even if it's through a derivative token, so that we can then kind of have that interoperability. Whereas before, all these things were siloed. Obviously, you get access to much better investment opportunities if you have $10 million or $100 million or $1 billion than if you have $100, right? And that's the way of the sort of gate-kept worlds at the moment.
So my question is more about the fundraising side of things.
Mm-hmm.
So I've had experience with fundraising in Web 2. I've had experience with fundraising in Web 3, and they seem to be quite different.
Yep.
And I think there is a playbook, pretty much, or a few playbooks for Web 2. It's, you roughly understand what the investors want. They understand, where the startups come from. So there's very clear communication most of the time. With Web3, it seems more chaotic, in my opinion. Maybe I'm just, didn't have enough experience there. But I'm curious, what are the suggestions for people, coming into Web3 with Web2 experience, from the startup perspective and fundraising perspective, of what your maybe tips or best practice would be?
I think looking at it from the investor standpoint, the difference between Web 2 and Web 3 is just thinking about time and exit. So in a traditional Web 2 investment, like if you take venture, most venture funds are 5-year funds with a 2-year add-on. And so their expectation is they're going to make that investment and hold on to it for whatever is left in their fund of the 7-year time period, usually. And the closer you get to that, then they start to look at different kinds of investments because they know they're going to be obliged to liquidate those positions. And so they look at you about that time horizon, and also that the exit is going to be an IPO or a trade sale, because those are the two Web 2 types of exits. So they'll also look at what sector you're in and think, oh, how's the IPO market look for that? Because typically when the IPO market is hot for a particular sector, then they love investing in that stuff in VC at that time, which of course doesn't make any sense because those are going to have to IPO 3 or 4 years later. But that's the way VCs are. And in Web3, it's different. So Web3 investing, I'd say 5 years ago, followed a similar mold just because that's what people knew in VC. And slowly it became more and more focused on liquid positions and tokens. So I think where we were in 2018 to 2021 was, okay, we'll make an equity investment, or if you have a token, we'll invest in the token. And then that moved to equity plus a token warrant because we want to have the token when it's available. And then nowadays it's like, where's your token, right? And the reason is more about how they think about risk. So, if I have access to the token and I'm on the token table, then I have, an unlock schedule and I have access to liquidity, and I'll have that in lieu of IPO risk. The risk I'm taking is that your token goes to zero over the 2-year holding period, not that you will never get out the door as an IPO. And so you will see most people who are Web3 native investors now just want to participate in the token because that's the instrument they understand. That's the instrument of Web3. We are the same. So at Animoca Brands, we invest in equity. We're happy to. But if you don't have a plan for a token, for us, we don't see that as a Web3 investment because our job as a strategic investor is to be able to help you with your tokens. So if you don't have tokens, we can't help. So
I have a follow-up question on this. So token adds a lot of ops overhead, which is a bit of an issue for the team. Like if you have a few co-founders, you don't really want to manage the token and all of the token holders, especially if it's just not just the investors, it's like all of the retail and stuff. How do you deal with that? Like, in our case, again, we got the investment, we don't have a token.
Yep.
We ideally don't want to have a token until it's, more, there's more foundations for that. But what you're saying is that, if we are seeking the investment, excuse me, we want to have it early, right? So there's a bit of a clash between what the team wants, what the investors want, and how do we reconcile that?
So I think if your plan is to have a token as part of the business, that's fine, because I think the investors are happy to wait for that as long as it's in your plan. And that's up to you to negotiate how long they're going to be happy waiting, I guess, because you'll get pressure from them, because for them, that's going to be not their exit, but it's going to be their visibility to an exit at some point. And so I think that part, is up to your negotiation. I think if you're let's call it a services business in Web3, where your focus is Web3, but you don't have a token of your own involved in the business model of your business, I think that's difficult, to be honest. I don't think there's anything wrong with it, but it just makes it harder to fundraise.
Okay. Thank you.
I have a follow-up question to that. When you mean token, you mean like cap table token, or it could be a token that is supporting the business model? Because, for example, in the case of music, right, you have legal contracts with labels. They would never let a company that has liquid equity that could just change in a minute, right? So basically opening the cap table to very liquid positions would impact the core of the business model because of legal agreements. But I assume it's not just music, I guess. No one wants to, JP Morgan is not going to do a partnership with you if tomorrow you could be owned by someone else.
Yes.
How do you differentiate both?
So I think that's about building your token cap table, because typically you'd want to bring on investors and lock them up for a period of time. And also there are very few businesses even today in Web3 that are decentralized enough that actually the control doesn't reside with the original founders and management, because usually, frankly, the floats are relatively small. Most projects at most are going to end up with like a 30% float, I would guess, at least in the first several years. But I think it's about thinking about where your business captures value. And so very often a Web3 business by definition captures value in the token, because you're building the network effects of the relationships with your customers. And so the value is captured in that token. And so the investors want that value. And that's why they want to share in that with the token. It doesn't mean necessarily that they are going to, that they're going to dump on day one. And that's up to you to negotiate those lockup terms and everything to make everybody comfortable, which is not dissimilar to, tag along, drag along rights to an IPO if you have an equity investment.
So it could be a partial tokenization of the cap table then?
What I was suggesting was, I guess, tokenization, but with restrictions.
Okay, thank you.
You could perhaps use a share of the trading rev instead of giving tokens out to, for example, music, certain key players. That way you wouldn't have to rely on dumps. Is that something that you've seen before, or similar strategies?
Yes, although another way to think about it is, I guess in a more traditional Web3 form, is you can create some kind of staking protocol where there are network fees or profit shares or, fee revenue that comes out of the fact that you actually say to your investors, hey, the best way for you to earn a return on this investment is to hold it and stake it, because you have a big position and this is going to give you an annuity. And then they just view it as a slightly different kind of investment. More like investing in a stock that gives dividends.
Yeah. Back to me again. Sorry about this. So at the moment, one of the big metas is stable coins, and there's this whole like narrative of a stable coin for everything. How far do you think that everything can go, or what's the most interesting thing that you've seen have a stable coin be applied to it?
So I think lately what I've started seeing is people trying to define stable coins through backing tokens with other assets or portfolios of assets that are not just fiat or treasuries from strong economies. And I think that's the part that's interesting. As I mentioned, so for example, this figure portfolio of home equity loans, I'm not an actuary. I can't tell you whether US home equity loans are actually as good a bet as the US dollar or something like that. Obviously there are people who can tell you that, but the idea of kind of broadening the definition of what is stable as a backing, I think that's quite interesting, right? Now, there are some obvious candidates. Many people are trying to tokenize gold. That's been a popular one. But can you tokenize, think of every other rare earth metal, et cetera. The sky is the limit with all of these things. So I think the interesting thing will be how these get adopted, because the more exotic they become, the harder they are for also consumers to understand, right? And that's when we all get into, risk management difficulties.
Awesome. I'll just quick grab this one. Awesome. Well, can we get a big round of applause for Robbie? Thank you, Robbie, for joining us. Very cool. And so yeah, this has been day one of BuildStation. Later on today, we're going to have some founder roasts. So you guys will be up here, and then we'll have our panel of judges who will roast you, and this will all be about your initial pitch. So you'll have 60 seconds to kind of share what you're doing. And on Thursday, we'll have a bit of a longer one where you can give a bit more of your deck. But today is all about just your elevator pitch and to get that raw feedback. And yeah, to keep on going for the rest of the weeks. So yeah, again, another big round of applause. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate it.